Welcome back, and hopefully in that activity you've now sort of outlined where you fit into the sort of operational management, where your responsibilities, direct or indirect, lie, and you've looked specifically at your responsibilities for designing, managing and improving systems that are within your roles and responsibilities. When we were looking at things previously, we started to mention risks, and I want us to start looking now at what could go wrong. What sort of things do we need to consider? What can adversely impact on our operations? What are the key areas that could impact, and what situations have we got to make sure we're managing well? What situations where poor decisions could have an impact on the company? And for those sort of areas, what is our contingency? How do we maintain business continuity? How are we going to recover after some sort of disaster or some sort of risk has reared its head? We need to be thinking about those sort of things. Yes, what could happen is a massive question, but just because we don't know, we can't just say, well, anything can happen, so we can't plan for it, we'll just deal with it when it happens. That would be naive and ill-advised for a business. And yes, there are things that are disasters, such as fires, floods, tornadoes, natural disasters that we can have plans for, but there are also things such as lack of materials, a shortage of the raw materials we need, these sort of variances that our main production line breaks down, or our entire sales force gets food poisoning after we've had an annual sales function, or I don't know, the payroll clerk is sick on the day that the payroll has to be issued. These are potential things that could be a disaster for a business and its staff, and particularly for its operations, if we don't have some plans in place. So it's important that as part of our operational planning, we're doing some sort of risk analysis and including some sort of contingency planning, not just for major disasters, but for things on a smaller scale. Preparing for events such as loss of data, people, customers, suppliers, unknowns that we're not sure about. We need to make contingency planning part of our operational planning so that we're trying to mitigate against these risks. We've identified some of the sorts of risks we come across, and some of them are external and we'll have little control over them. Supplier issues, shortages of the raw materials that are coming in, but others are internal where we can manage and control them. Production line breaking down. Has it been maintained properly, sufficiently? Has it been used correctly? Has it been monitored enough? All these are areas of responsibility that might fall under the operations management. Maybe not directly, but as part of the plan. So we need to manage against them and mitigate these risks. So how do we go about managing against risk? It's relatively simple, but it's often ignored. There's lots of recognised processes or models out there, and organisations have sometimes adopted them, or they've developed their own, but there are some basic processes and key principles that will be in all of them, or should be in all of them. By addressing all the business critical operations, and having a good plan that identifies all the critical ones, then we can outline what we need to do to try and minimise any losses. The first stage is to identify risks. So for each functional part of the business, we do some sort of risk analysis. We'll be identifying the various risks that could be have a serious impact on the business. What has a potential to seriously disrupt or harm the business? At the end of that, we should have a risk analysis which will have a huge potential list of threats. And if we tried to create contingency planning for each of them, it may be overwhelming. So the next stage is we need to prioritise that risk. One of the greatest challenges in contingency planning is that we do too much planning for disasters. It's got to be a careful balance between over-preparing for something that will never happen, or making adequate preparation so that you can respond quickly and effectively if there is a crisis, if it does occur. You need to be able to analyse the impact of each risk and estimate its likelihood of occurring, and then you can see which risks are worth spending the money on, basically, which ones we're going to mitigate for. The business process is about long-term survival. So if it's maintaining cash flow, if it's keeping market share, or if it's staff not being available, they've got different levels of priority that we need to allocate them. And from this, we can decide what we want to do, how we're going to respond to the risk. This will need to be considered depending on what we just talked about, the priority, And also factors such as cost, availability of resources, likelihood of it occurring, and what the potential risk is to the business. Okay, what we could decide to do. Well, we could decide to ignore the risk. So if the organisation can live with the impact of that risk in the event of it happening, or the cost is prohibitive, or they could get themselves back on their feet, then that'd be fair enough. We could decide to monitor it. If the risk of the event is unlikely, we could have plans for if it occurs, but we could just continue to see whether this is going to be something that might come up, or we can mitigate for that risk. So we either do something to eliminate it or minimize the risk that it could happen. So that might be to avoid the risk. If the condition causing the risk can be isolated, then we can make sure it's taken out of the equation, or we can outsource the risk. And by that I mean we can assign the responsibility to a third party. So it might be for security of IT, or it might be reclaiming of data if something goes down then or goes missing. Then we might have outsourced that to somebody as part of our recovery plan. And the outcome will be some sort of contingency planning. Now that might be a separate contingency plan with actions that come in when risks happen, or it could be combined within your operational plan. But as long as we've assessed the risks and planned some contingency, some actions to either eliminate or prevent those risks, or some sort of disaster recovery plan to decide what to do if these risks happen and therefore have a major impact on our operations. So let's start to have a look at what we've looked at in this session. So our aim at the start of this session was to understand operational management approaches and models. And we said by the end of the session we should be able to analyse the key components of our operational management, including inputs, transformation process and outputs, and we looked at that at the beginning. Describe the components of a viable operations plan. We talked about what should be in an operations plan, and we talked about what makes it viable. Explain the importance of contingency planning. We just talked about that. Describe the policies and processes and procedures that affect operational planning. We talked about HR policies, external policies. We talked about sales and marketing, and we talked about how operational planning supports and is linked with business strategy and strategic objectives. And as we just started to say, we explained how sales and marketing contribute to the development of operational plans. So let's have a look at an activity. So for this activity, I want you to start looking at risks. So think about what you've identified as being responsible for in activities 1 and 2 for this session, and then identify the risks, assess them, prioritize them, and then it asks you to look at key stakeholders you might have to involve in the planning for those risks. So there's a worksheet again which has got a little bit more information and describes what the activity is. When that's completed and uploaded, you can move on to session 2.